Welcome, everyone, to our first interview with John Stevens from the Federal Trust, a former MEP for the Conservative Party, and now a member of the Rejoin EU party, but also, in a surprising fact, the man who did the campaign of the Dolphin against Nigel Farage. Do we talk about that, or has things moved on, John?
Well, that was a long time ago, 2010. That was when we still thought we could stop Farage taking over the Conservative Party and hijacking it and forcing us into a referendum.
You definitely knocked the stuffing out of him because he didn't seem to want to run after that. He was very reluctant and sort of came out and disappeared into the ether.
To David Cameron, who was obviously the new Prime Minister at the time, the opportunity to actually deal with the pro Brexit, pro UKIP elements in the Conservative Party, because it showed that he didn't have actually any real reason to be afraid of them. But he unfortunately took a rather different view, and the rest, as they say, is history.
How are you finding Farage's little build up and stint on social media? Are you believing that, or do you think it's a bit of smoke and mirrors in terms of social media?
Well, I think Reform's performance in this election is going to be worse than the punters seem to be claiming at the moment, and the commentators seem to be claiming. I mean, the fundamental problem for Reform is that their flagship policy is Brexit. And now nearly three-quarters of the population recognize that Brexit has been a bit of a disaster. And so why should they be listened to on anything else? Since what they've sold already is clearly a dud. But on top of that, Brexit has also failed by their own criteria, because they're saying that the whole point of Brexit, and that was the center of their contribution to the campaign in the referendum in 2016, was that it was all about immigration and controlling immigration. And in fact, Brexit has made the immigration problem a hell of a lot worse. By getting out of freedom of movement, we have taken ourselves away from essentially a mobility of labor policy into one which is a genuine immigration policy, because people who came under freedom of movement from other countries in the EU, they spent a bit of time in the UK, on an average about 5 years, and worked, but then they went back to their homes in other parts of the EU. Whereas now what's happening is we're bringing in labor from outside Europe, from South Asia, from West Africa, and the vast majority of these people come with an expectation of permanent settlement, and that is a much more challenging task for the national budget and for the fiscal position of the country.
Aren't they coming over and working though? Isn't that a good
Oh,
thing?
they are indeed, and we need these workers. I mean, and we should be very grateful that they're coming. I mean, the other problem is that if we take the National Health Service in particular, we need immigrants to come. When they came from Europe, they were coming from countries which were, on the whole, poorer than us. That's true in Eastern Europe. But because we were all in the EU and we were providing, as part of the EU, structural fund payments and things to Bulgaria and to Romania, to other parts of Eastern Europe, there was a quid pro quo in the whole situation. There was a certain justice. So although we were, to a degree, benefiting from the training paid for by their taxpayers and taking skilled workers from them for our use, we were also giving something back. And there was a structure in the EU in which these countries become more prosperous over time, which is what has happened to Eastern Europe. The problem now is that we're taking people overwhelmingly from poorer countries I mean, the taxpayers of India and Sri Lanka and Pakistan and Nigeria have paid to train these doctors and nurses. They need a lot of those doctors and nurses themselves, but we are bringing them here, taking advantage of the differential in wealth. And and we're not giving anything back to those countries, essentially. And that's a much more morally problematic situation, I would suggest.
There's definitely been conversations had with a number of leading politicians over, for example, doctors coming from certain parts of the world that need those doctors to remain, and they're being enticed to come over to the UK. So we're actually damaging economies. Whereas
That's absolutely right. I
within
mean, this is
Europe,
a problem of the rich world exploiting the developing world. I mean, it is a rather egregious example of it.
So Italy, Spain, and I believe Greece have an excess of medical staff. They've got much more medical staff than they have positions available. So it's
That's absolutely
literally,
right. Germany too. And I mean, it's a ridiculous situation that there are a surplus of trained medical staff in the EU who we could be using, but we're not using. We're taking them instead from Nigeria or Sri Lanka or um, Pakistan or India, countries all of which need the staff who their taxpayers have paid to train.
yeah, it's definitely like a money saving exercise at the detriment of other countries, which is
Well, the
just
fundamental problem is that we haven't spent
ethically.
enough money on health, and we need to get ourselves up to the European per capita average of expenditure on health. I mean, that would seem to be a fairly reasonable target, which we're not meeting. And there's no way around it. We need to invest more money, and that requires that we generate more money. We need growth. I mean, the fundamental issue in this election is growth. None of the problems which have been revealed in part by Brexit, which have been around for a very long time, the differences between North and South in our country, the left behind regions, the problems of funding our public services, the problems of addressing the standards in the NHS and things. All of these require a hell of a lot of money, and none of the parties in this election are being honest about the fiscal position in which we're in, which is an extremely serious one. We're massively over borrowed. And we need growth desperately. And the only credible way the British economy can get into a pattern of growth that is sufficient to sustain the public services that we deserve and require is if we rejoin the EU. We got to get back into the single market. We have to get back into the mainstream of the European market on our doorstep. And if we fail to do that, then everything else which these the government and the Labour Party are promising will be quite impossible to fulfill.
It's interesting you bring that up because I assume a lot of people would turn around and go, well, there's a whole world out there that you can trade with. Why do we need to focus on 27, soon to probably be about 30 countries inside the EU?
Well, because trade is dominated by geography and time zone. And we actually chose probably the worst possible moment in the last 40 years to leave the EU, because what we've seen over the last 40 years is a huge growth in globalization. And it's true that trade has become international in the way that it simply wasn't before, for a whole range of reasons. We've seen the rise of Asian economies, particularly China, and which has transformed the patterns of economic activity. But that is now peaked because we're now into a period, for a whole range of reasons, geopolitical, the rivalry between America and China and things, in which globalization is going into reverse, essentially. You're getting, America in particular is leading this. It's becoming much more protectionist. It's withdrawing into its own market. But the Chinese also have an increasingly protectionist market themselves. The globalization is in retreat. And we desperately need a large home market. And our home market is the European home market. And you say, well, you don't need that in services, but that's not true. Services are dominated, legal services, financial services, they're dominated by the time zone. And we're not going to be able to service the Far East unless we stay up all night. It's you've got to. That's why the financial services are moving to places like Singapore already, but Dubai is the new center for dealing between the Asian market and the European market. What's happening to the City of London is that its dollar business is being sucked off to America, and its euro business is being sucked into the EU, and our Asian business is being taken by Dubai and Singapore. And because we are not part of a major home market, which is what the EU was for us, we fall between all the stools.
Isn't it just about having belief, though? Can't we just believe in being better?
Well, there's no harm in hoping. But I think that belief isn't the way you generate growth and economic performance. You have to have something solid. We had a very, very good position, actually, inside the EU because we were the financial center and the services center more generally of the European single market. And we dominated that even without being in the single currency. And we've thrown that away completely. And we have nothing to offer in as an alternative, because the idea that we could become an offshore, freewheeling global center is against the grain now of the way in which international trade is going. It's becoming more protectionist, more regionalized. Globalization, as I said before, is in retreat. And we have to have a big home market. There's never been an example in history of a major financial center, we're talking now about the city, of a major financial center that hasn't had two things. It's had a large home market, and it's had a dominant position in the currency of that home market. And we could have had that with the euro. We had that to a degree, even though we weren't in it. And we had the home market of the single market. Now, the euro-denominated business will be in various centers inside the EU. The dollar business is going to be run out of New York and Chicago, and perhaps increasingly Miami. And the international business in Asia, which may be increasingly dominated by the Chinese currency, the renminbi, is going to be run out of Singapore.
What do you think about the news report that's come out from the University of California saying that Brexit's caused long-term damage? I've got a bit of a quote here. The general assessment was from the University of California, the decision to leave the EU in 2016 has had lasting negative effects on the UK economy and political system. The study points out that Brexit has exacerbated regional inequalities, dried up EU funding for poorer regions, and diverted attention from pressing domestic issues to polarizing debates.
Well, I think this simply confirms the reality that Brexit has revealed a whole range of problems inside Britain and made them worse. It's made the issues of Northern Ireland worse. It's made the issues of, it's revived the issue of Scottish independence. It's revived the issue of Irish unification. It has exposed the extent to which the left behind regions of the north of England in particular have suffered at the expense of from the domination of London and the southeast, and the highly financially orientated economy that we have created in the last 30 years. So all these problems have been increased and made more difficult to solve because of the economic hit that Brexit implies, the fact that it is structurally reducing our capacity for growth. But there's a deeper thing here. I think it's forced us into potentially a very dangerous and divisive political climate. I mean, and this goes beyond the fact that the way in which the politics of Brexit evolved, the way in which the referendum was conducted and what has happened since then, has introduced a level of antagonism and a level of deceit and lying, a capacity to evade reality, which is extremely dangerous in a democracy. And that's one of the reasons why I don't believe that saying that we need to take a long-term view on this is going to take a long time to get back into the EU and things is the right way of looking at it, because the longer we wait, the more dangerous these aspects of our politics will become. And historians sometimes compare our position to the last time we had a fundamental identity crisis in Britain, which was in the 17th century. We had a crisis of the Isles. We had tensions in Scotland and Ireland. We had tensions over religion, Protestantism and Catholicism. We had alternative models abroad. On the whole, the royalist side in the 17th century looked to absolutist France. The parliamentary side looked towards Holland. And we had an 80-year crisis, which ended with what we now call the Glorious Revolution and the arrival of a king from Holland, William III. But it was extremely divisive and destructive. We had a civil war. And we now face a similar situation, I feel. We're torn between an American model of low taxation, low services, and also perhaps with Trump, an increasing critique by particularly the super rich of the merits of democracy from the point of view of protecting their interests. And on the other hand, we have a European model, which is a much more inclusive and less extreme liberal economic structure. But there are also cultural dimensions to that, the nature of our societies. The model that we should become like a highly immigrant-orientated society with a global identity, which is what America aspires to, much more successfully than us. Or are we actually fundamentally much more like European countries, rooted with very established and long-rooted histories and identities, and that this is a turmoil, because for a long time we wanted to be both in a way. We wanted to have European public services and American taxes. We felt close to America in supporting what was left of our global role after losing the empire. But on the other hand, we recognized that for economic reasons, we needed to be close to Europe, and we're tied to the fate of Europe. We are much more affected by what happens in Ukraine than the Americans are.
Yeah.
So this is a real identity crisis that is building up in Britain.
You're running for MP for Kensington and Bayswater. What do you think the Rejoin EU party could bring to that area? What could you personally bring to that area if you were elected MP?
The constituency is in many respects a microcosm of Britain. It is highly divided. The north of the constituency, Goulburn in particular, is one of the poorest parts of the country, not just of London. And the south is one of the richest parts of the country, and one of the richest parts of London. And the economy of Kensington is dependent on the economy of London. It's highly orientated towards finance. There's a very large number of foreign people living there. There's huge tension on housing. All these are questions which are intimately linked to the decision to do Brexit, and can only really be addressed if we reverse Brexit, because the future of London as a financial centre outside the EU is extremely dubious. Our capacity to deal with housing, I mean, building even houses, is a problem, because we've sent home a very large number of highly skilled building workers, and we've not been able to replace them from outside the EU. And the whole questions related to immigration and the price that we're paying for having left freedom of movement and moved in favor of drawing our immigrant labor from further afield. These are all issues which are absolutely central to the conditions in Kensington. And there are examples in Kensington of all of these issues. And that's why I think it's the perfect place to put on the agenda rejoining the EU, so that we're going to get a Labour government, that they're going to win this election. They're going to win it big, probably. And the question is, will the Labour Party be able to move back towards Europe? And the more votes there are for rejoining the EU, the more confidence Keir Starmer can have as Prime Minister that this is the way to go and that he will have support to do that. But Kensington is also a symbolic seat for the Conservative Party. It was where Michael Portillo, some time ago, thought that he could base his campaign to take over the leadership of the Conservative Party. It has been one of the most conservative seats in the country. And the future of the Conservative Party is also on the line in this election. It's going to suffer a very major defeat. But then the question is, can it rebuild? And the only way it can rebuild is if it admits that Brexit was a monumental error, because otherwise it's just going to be sucked into the nexus of reform and Nigel Farage, and this problem will go on, and we won't have a proper opposition. And in a healthy democracy, you need both a sensible government and a sensible opposition. So by voting for Rejoin the EU party, Conservatives can send a signal that their party, once it goes into opposition, once it tries to pick itself up from this, what is going to be almost certainly a major defeat, has to reject Brexit, has to get back into a position of being pro-European and resisting the temptations to go further off into the far right.
Brilliant. John Stevens, thank you very much.
Fix the damage that even Brexiteers can see. Vote Rejoin this July.